Well, welcome to another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. We've got a whole lot of topics we're going to cover today. We're going to take a look at the budget. We're going to take a look at not just the budgetary spending on Ukraine, but what is going on in Ukraine, but some of the larger can-U.S. relationship in the wake of President Biden's visit to Canada. So who better than Diane Francis, an American, spent most of her life in Canada. She's cross-border. She's a journalist. She's an author, almost a dozen books, I think. She has a relatively new newsletter on Substack, to which I subscribe, so I keep track of what she's thinking about. Editor-at-large of at the National Post, and also a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. And we'll come back to this, but I just want to note it, Diane. Welcome. In 2019, you were awarded the Trizub Award as a friend of Ukraine for your anti-corruption work there. Congratulations on that. I didn't know that.
Yeah, thank you. It's the diaspora's highest honor to someone who isn't really Ukrainian.
Yeah, I was going to say, come to Saskatchewan. We'll get.
I know. I have it turns out I have a Ukrainian great grandfather that I didn't know about, but anyway, no, that was a great honor. And people aren't also aware of the fact that, I mean, they know my stuff in Canada. And by the way, I'm a citizen of Canada and the United States.
Yes, yes.
But I've been to Ukraine 30 times.
Wow.
I have spent probably cumulatively a year of my life. I have friends. I was in the software development industry there until the war. I've been leading, helping them lead the anti-corruption efforts that, Putin is now cracked down on and ended for a while. And so, and I've lost 3 friends in the war.
Yeah, I'm sure. It's stunning. So we'll come to that. I just want to get you off the top because of your financial background here on the budget. New aid will go to there. New aid for Ukraine puts federal spending at about $8 billion, I think, in total. And yesterday, or on budget day, they pledged $2.4 billion for a loan to the country. Don't know how that'll work because it's defaulting on most of its debt at this point. So what do you make of what we are doing and then what the West in general is doing? But $8 billion, a lot of money from the Canadian perspective, but perhaps not all that helpful from Ukraine's perspective in terms of our inability to actually provide equipment.
No, I think that Canada was very slow off the mark, and the diaspora is very large here. People don't realize that 15% of Canada's population is Slavic. That's Polish and Czechs and Serbs and, of course, Ukrainians. And they have been very upset. And I think they're still not all that happy with what the Liberals have done. But they're starting to pull their weight. And I think Mr. Biden sort of made a few phone calls and said, get with the program.
Yeah.
And also it helps them fulfill the fact that they've lagged in terms of NATO expenditures for years. Canada is a laggard and our military is in terrible shape. And so all of that stuff is sort of behind it. Whatever we can do is fine. The numbers sound huge, but I don't know. I think it's roughly 80 billion the Americans have gifted. This is not a loan, gifted. That's about what people spend on video games a year in the United States. So, it's a vastly rich country. So is Canada. And, and this is the cause that the West has to rise up to and is rising up to, amazingly, because it's the line in the sand against Putin. And he doesn't stop with Ukraine. He will continue going on. And he has to be, removed, or his army has to be decimated. And I think that's going to happen. I'm pretty confident. But the price paid by Ukrainians willingly is just horrific.
When you read the reports, and I was just going through some of this last night, that the Ukrainian forces have been genuinely degraded. Most of their trained soldiers, or many of their trained soldiers, have actually been lost in battle. They've got all of the people that they have recruited who have volunteered, just the ordinary men and women who have showed up, but they're taking a severe hit.
It's a severe hit, and the government is not publishing the numbers. Neither is Russia, by the way.
Right.
And so I would say that proportionate to Russia, which has 142 million people, and Ukraine, which began with 42 million people, it's proportionally higher for Ukrainians because it was a surprise attack by a major established military force, which isn't very competent, but nonetheless, it's been a scramble in a year to get a military force of any size in Ukraine. And now they have 1 million people in their military, male and female. And I think it's, I talk to my Ukrainian friends, and the cemeteries are overloaded, and it's horrific. It's a genocide.
I think that is the word, isn't it? We always have fights over whether or not and when to use that word, but just given the fact that their standing military was so outweighed by Russia. All right, so let's just put this in a little context. So Zelensky is
just on the genocide thing.
Yeah.
United Nations definition of genocide is the purposeful destruction of a state or an ethnic group. And that's exactly what Putin said he wanted to do just before he invaded. So he's self-declared genocidist.
So we have got Xi going to visit Putin, and now Zelensky has invited Xi to come and visit. Who knows if that will happen? How do you read the meeting between Russia and China? Is that a tacit agreement that they're going to support in a real way Russians with money and more armaments, et cetera, or was that just kind of a shot across the bow to the West, which is look at what you're facing?
I think it was a customer, China, who's getting bargain rate prices for oil and natural gas and for coal from Russia, doing what they have to do to please their customer. That was a total flop. That 3-day summit, from Putin's point of view, will never admit it. They did not even sign a large contract to bring more, the gas pipeline through Siberia that he wanted China to pay for. They are doing what they have to do to keep the oil flowing because they're getting a fortune in savings. So is India. So India and China, in return, have been polite and so on. They've never condemned the invasion, but they've never endorsed it. They exempt themselves from UN votings. And this is the price they're paying to get a discount to grow their economies faster than they ever would have had a chance to before. The amount of oil and gas, which I wrote about in my latest newsletter, is breathtaking. I think it's as much as Iran and Iraq produce. And so it's huge amounts of oil and gas going into that country, and coal, those two countries. And so what you have happening is one of the biggest redistributions of wealth in world history as a result of this war. He not only kicked his customers in Europe in the teeth, who have stopped buying his oil and gas and will completely shortly, but got them to fight him, to destroy his military, and his customers in the East have him by the you-know-whats.
Mm-hmm. Again, it raises that question about Canada being there for our allies, for Europe, for the Germanys of the world, despite their arrangements with Putin, but to be able to step up, and we can't even provide LNG, or we won't. Does that put us really in a troubling position with our allies? Nobody's saying much out loud about it. The commentators are talking about it, but should we not have been able to step up with at least that?
Well, the feds deigned to approve, I think, 500,000 barrels more a day export of oil to the United States, which is our principal customer. The LNG and the whole situation in the resource base, which is the base of the Canadian economy and our prosperity, has been attacked since 2015 by the Trudeau group. And in the name of climate change and all of that sort of thing, they don't even understand what the other climate change fans understand, and that is natural gas is the transition fuel. Till we can have, renewable energy that is affordable and that actually can provide uninterrupted power. That's not the case yet. It always has to be supplemented.
Yeah.
So, you've got excuse me, I have something on my, so the transition fuel Canada has, so does the United States. So since Germany and Europe got off, realized they had to stop taking Russian oil and gas, which they were dependent on.
Absolutely.
Around, and when he invaded, the Americans have now become the largest supplier in the world of LNG. The beauty of LNG is that it's transportable by ship. And so, one of these huge super tankers of LNG, and Americans have actually more natural gas reserves than Canada does, but we do. We have stranded, the Trudeau government has purposely stranded the number one assets that Canada has to offer the world, and that is oil and gas. It's the only world-class industry we have. It is just shocking to me that this has been allowed to happen. And it's all in the name of greenifying. And, they jet around and they talk about greenifying. And I thought the best example was that, the German chancellor came and talked to Trudeau a few months ago and said, I will help you. I will write a check for you to bring natural gas east from Alberta, and I will build an industrial sector in the Maritimes of LNG plants, because we need LNG and it's the transition fuel. And he said, there's no business case. And the Americans are proving it's absolute rubbish.
That there is, absolutely.
It's a disgrace. It borders on sabotage. He's got to be smarter than that, or maybe he doesn't know anything about anything.
I think one of the phrases you used is kind of, the government is entranced by environmentalism, and it does. I mean, everybody agrees that there are climate change issues and we have to focus on that. But as you say, we have transition plans. The green sector is not ready for prime time. And so we're going to be using oil and gas for the next little while, 20, 30, perhaps maybe even 50 years. So we have to keep that industry growing and modern and as clean as can be.
Yeah, and every LNG tanker displaces Russian oil and gas, displaces coal in China, displaces coal in India. That is the transition in South Korea. And the problem is that we cannot, and it's not that Mr. Trudeau is right when there's no business case, there's no political will to do this. And the cost of pipelines and the cost of all of the standards and so on around it, imposed by the federal government, have made it impossible to finish anything on time. The pipeline that they bought to go to Vancouver is, I think, 30 billion instead of 8 billion in 4 years, and it's not even halfway done. And it was along an old already approved route. Mm-hmm. And there's an LNG pipeline project that's crawling its way through to go to northern BC. Americans do these things because it's in the national interest. So you declare a national interest purpose and magic can happen. And we could have been helpful, but we're not helpful.
Well, we saw that actually in the middle of the pandemic, the speed with which government could move to repurpose some of its activities to help industry repurpose to deal with a crisis. And this is a crisis that they've declared themselves on the environment, and obviously the situation in Ukraine is.
Yeah, and Trudeau no sooner turned down the German chancellor, who had a check. Then 3 days later, the German chancellor went to Australia and signed a $40 or $50 billion LNG deal. It's a little further distance from Europe than Canada.
Yeah.
The deal was done. There is a business case. One government takes care of its people and manages its economy to create wealth as well as to redistribute wealth. And we have one that just redistributes. It's like a trust fund kids government.
I want to ask a little bit about, because when President Biden was here, there was some relief on the part of Canadians that he publicly stated we were carved out of the exemptions under the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, that we would count as American for the Buy American part of it, so that we would be able to continue to do business with our largest trading partner. But I think the penny has dropped for people that all of the money pouring into development, into clean tech growth in the US is going to put us at a huge disadvantage. So we saw in the budget kind of a response to that. But it may be a little too late at this point in terms of the speed at which the Americans are going, unless you think that's really not going to be seen to its fruition.
Well, I think the exemption is important, and of course, keeping being inside the loop is critical. That's critical, and that I think that was expected.
Yeah.
And
it was a fact. It was just that he said it publicly that made everybody feel better.
Yeah, and I think that they have set higher standards now, and we have to match the standards. That's why the expense.
But you believe that that's real in the U.S., despite the political split now in the two houses, that this goes forward.
I don't know how to read that, but the Biden government is pretty clear on the direction they want to go, and they're there for another 2 years. So I would think that it'll mostly move forward.
Yeah, you can get a lot done in 2 years. What do you make of the American commitment? We see some parts of the Republican Party saying, let's cool all the expenditures in Ukraine. We have many issues here in our own country to deal with. There's a split in the Republican Party, and then a split between the Republicans and the Democrats. And we're all in the West pretty, we have short attention spans. We love issues at the beginning, and we're there and we have their back. But is this going to last? Will our backing of Ukraine last until this is resolved? I mean, Joe Biden said, as long as it takes, but that implies it could be a very long time.
Well, nobody knows how long. And as you pointed out, the casualties are horrific. Yeah. I think the cash flow is going to continue to come. I see much more backbone and resolve in Europe. And I think they have to take over a lot of the share of the American burden, too, to be fair, because they're the immediate beneficiaries. You see Germany doubling its military. You see huge amounts of expenditures. You see the formation. You see 4 European countries, Scandinavian countries, forming one air force. I think you're going to end up with a European air army, armed forces, a European and or NATO. And I think that, a standing armed force. And that's what I think you're going to have happen. And in that case, then the burden is shifted a little bit more in their direction. But as I said, the cost, even the excessive amounts of money that the Americans have been helpful in giving to Ukraine, is only what they spend on video games every year. This is the richest economy in the history of the world. And we tend to forget it. It's big, and it's messy politically. Now, you also saw the principal rival to Mr. Trump and the MAGA movement, DeSantis, recently make a gaffe involving Ukraine, and he quickly backtracked. I don't think, and you look at the polling, it's 70-80% of Americans are totally solidly behind helping Ukraine.
So that will stay. It does get caught up, and that is the fear that, you're in full-on election season from here on into the presidential race, and then domestic things tend to take over.
That's right. Yeah, but, I also don't disagree with the Speaker of the House, McCarthy, saying that there's going to be no blank check. And, more controls over how that money was spent and who got it and so on were put into place. I don't think that's inappropriate. I hope our money isn't badly spent either. So, it's politics. It's all politicized. But I think basically this is a moral war. This is another Second World War moral case. This is not Iraq. This is not Vietnam. This is about an evil man who's committing a genocide in our living rooms every night. And so I don't think any person who is, sentient to what's going on in the world can be anything but completely, willing to do what's necessary.
You have, as we mentioned at the beginning of our conversation here, awarded as a friend of Ukraine, given the Treasure Award for decades-long anti-corruption work, and that is one of the cases that is made about Ukraine, that it was and may still be, and we see Zelensky firing people every once in a while. That there is a core corruption there. What's your take on that?
That's a very good question, and I like to answer it, and I answer it a lot here in the US where I talk to people that are involved in helping. Ukraine, after 1991, became independent. I was the first Western journalist to interview the new president. They were orphaned. Unlike the Central and Eastern European countries, satellite countries, they all got taken into the European Union immediately. And then, of course, eventually most of them into NATO. So they were fine. And they had corruption. Russia is corrupt. The system is corrupt. But the European Union's institutions took over and they cleaned up their act. The same thing is going to happen. It didn't happen in Ukraine, but the same thing is going to happen because they've signed an accession to the European Union. And so all the judiciary and all the rotten stuff they have in that country will disappear. Now, we fought for years about it. It was dangerous. There was about a 10-year period I didn't go to Ukraine because it wasn't a good idea to be an anti-corruption fighter. It was dangerous, but it was Russian influenced. This is how Russia kept control over it. They kept control over it by bribing their politicians, by skimming the wealth of the country, and perpetuating corruption. And so it's been a long process since 1991 to try and get out from under this Russian rotten system. When Zelensky got elected in 2019, we were all thrilled. He was a real reformer. He was going to do something. And we know what happened.
Yeah.
Putin said, oh, they're going to do it this time, so I'm going to take it before they do it. And that's why we have a war.
Everybody has the sense that he's the real deal. Is that your view, Zelensky?
Yes, he is. He's quite amazing, and you'll appreciate this because your background also is as a content provider, a writer, and a broadcaster. That's what he is, and people disparagingly called him a comedian. He's not a comedian. He's a satirist. He wrote movies and TV series and satirical skits in theater that with his wife, by the way.
Yeah.
Brilliant. He's a lawyer by trade. His father is the most famous computer scientist in Ukraine. His mother's a civil engineer. He was an only child. This guy is fantastic. And he built an entertainment empire before the war. And he just was so outraged at what was happening to his country with the president he followed, that he threw his hat in the ring, and the rest is history. But no, and that also he took all of his crew from his entertainment empire with him to be in the presidential office. So he has a writer's room around him. And so that's why he's clever himself, but all of the communications are brilliant, are pointed, are accurate, are pertinent, and inspiring. And that's
I watched the other night. I was catching up because I don't know when it happened, but David Letterman with his new show, the one, not his nightly show, went to Kiev and again, in terms of the optics and how the people around Zelensky and Zelensky himself managed this, down into a subway station in Kiev, that's where they shot the interview. Every time a train went by, they just spoke louder, but they wanted the protection of being there in the case of a bomb. It reinforced the reality in that city and in that country for every moment that they sat there. Like, that is brilliant communication, trying to make the rest of the world understand.
And of course, I don't have to tell you this. It's one thing to brilliantly communicate.
Right.
Goebbels is very good at it, but this is a moral, virtuous
Yeah.
message that they're communicating so well.
How do you see the end of this? I mean, there's a huge argument about whether the sanctions are even putting a tiny hit on Putin. I mean, he doesn't care if it impacts his people, but there's ways around it, and they're finding ways around it. I mean, people fall off of balconies in Moscow every, other day. It would, of course, be the most effective, I think, if he was taken out internally, but that's not likely going to happen. How do you see this coming to an end?
He has to be defeated by the Ukrainians, and then he will not last very long. And neither will the Russian
military defeat.
Yes,
has to happen.
And neither will the Russian Federation. It will be partitioned into several other republics. It will fall apart if the center doesn't hold. And this happened with Yeltsin too. And Ukraine left, and Kazakhstan and so on left. So what you're going to have is a repeat of that. When does it end? I think that this, and everybody says this, but the amount of support weapons wise and the timing by the Americans and the Europeans that is now flooded into that country, and the aptitude that their military force has demonstrated, I think they are going to make a huge push late spring, early summer, and by the fall they hope to, and it may be possible, to expel the Russians from their territories, which of course include Crimea, and then it's over.
You think they'd be able to get them out?
Putin can't last. That's an undeniable defeat, and he cannot survive that. And so that's number one. Number two, if that fails, if they give it their almighty and they push like crazy and they only get, say, halfway to the border, that may be also where it ends. And they're just going to have to accept the fact that he's taken even more land than he took in 2014, but and hope that he stops.
So you can foresee the possible loss of some territory, but with the impact on Ukraine in terms of the loss of people, they might have to at some point say, okay, enough.
Only if they do that. Only if they do that. And but I think, and they think, that they can push them out. They think they can do it.
You interestingly talked about, and we saw this even before Ukraine, the British and the French joining forces, but you're seeing some kind of European or NATO-led military force, because it's too expensive for smaller countries to do this anyway, that this might even breathe life into that this will be the reason for NATO to continue to exist.
This is the catalyst to create a stronger, tougher Europe. And that's important too for the world, because it's a free enterprise democratic space. And it's got a lot of people and a lot of wealth. I mean, collectively, the European Union is the size of the American economy. So, and both of them are 2/3 of the world's GDP. So we need a strong, well-defended Europe, and that's happening. That's already happening. They're tougher, they're smarter, and they realize they need each other, and they're stopping the bickering, Hungary accepted. And so you've got a better Europe as a result. The Americans are they're not damaged at all by this. And you've got, and hopefully a degradation of the Russian economy. I'm just working on a piece for the Atlantic Council. The Russian economy is collapsing. When he says it isn't, he's lying, because it is collapsing. And does he care? No.
Because of the cost, or because of the sanctions? I mean,
their factories are not getting technology they need to produce anything, including war materials. The Chinese are not giving them military aid. That was another reason that summit was a big flop. And, you know, and the oil and gas revenues now are subject to a $60 a barrel price cap. And that is absolutely destroying their revenues. So their revenues, the price cap the G7 did, came into being in February, and then on petroleum products. And so, you know, China and India are getting a bargain. They're making out like bandits. They're loving this because they're driving a hard bargain. But Russia's revenues have collapsed. Their export revenues are collapsing now as of the price cap. This is going to be the coup de grace that's going to get them economically. They cannot get past this.
But you're also saying that, I mean, even though they're selling the energy for a song at a discount, I mean, China and India have an insatiable appetite.
Well, it's not insatiable. I mean, they're buying a lot of volume at a bargain price. But that means that, you know, the Russians have to ship it at a bargain price. And at $60 a barrel, by the time you ship it around the other half of the world, I'm told it's probably a break-even proposition. So the treasury of the government is not getting a dime. The foreign exchange reserves are not going up. And, you know, the other thing that people, you know, in Western Canada, we completely understand that you have to spend millions to make millions. You got to keep drilling to find up new resource, you know, and that sort of thing. They're not doing any of that because the foreign capital is gone. And so Oleg Deripaska, who's a big billionaire oligarch, actually said last month, we're running out of cash. No foreign capital is coming in here. The government is going to dry up and blow away, I hope.
Is this the reason that we need to finally, as a country, put some weight behind our claims that we have sovereignty in the north when we don't have a piece of equipment up there to, you know, the Russians are in our airspace all the time. The Chinese are there operating on the seabed and mapping and all of that. And we do not have the response should the Russians, if they survive all of this or do it just for distraction purposes, continue to do that, continue to expose or to take advantage of that vulnerable entry point to North America?
Well, I hate to burst your bubble, but Canada does not control its sovereignty. The Americans do, which I forecasted was going to happen in 2014 because we just don't pull our weight militarily. And so, you know, we'd rather give people better teeth. And so when you want to do that, so we have nothing, as you pointed out, nothing at all. Our Navy is, I'm sure, very nice and efficient, but it's pathetic. We have more coastline than any other country in the world, and a Navy smaller than Sri Lanka's. And so, and we don't have anything that can, you know, we don't have big icebreakers up there. We can't get anything procurement wise through in a responsible, efficient way. So just a couple of weeks, I wrote about it, but the rest of the press didn't pick it up. Well, the liberal press, like the Globe and Mail and the CBC, didn't pick it up. And that is that couple of weeks after Trudeau was last elected, they quietly announced, the Pentagon and whoever was in D&D, that Canada was going that they were going to modernize.
Right.
Okay, NORAD.
Yes.
Okay. What that means is that Canada, and then just this year, Canada quietly again announced that their share of the modernization, because there's nothing up there, we've never done anything, is 40 billion. 40 billion. And that'll be spread over a number of years. Then they bought a bunch of jets from the United States. Mm-hmm. And this was a quid pro quo.
Yeah.
Make no mistake, our Arctic is completely safe because the Americans now control Canada's sovereign nation militarily. And we let it happen. And that's fine. That's fine as far as I'm concerned. But you know, let's not mythologize anything about the fact that this government has just neglected the military.
No, I certainly wouldn't. I've been there. I've been to alert our northernmost base, and I feel sorry for the people who are part of our military because they simply do not have the equipment to do even the very basic job that they need to do.
You know, they like to, liberals like to pounce, or the NDP, whatever's, they like to bounce on the fact, oh, well, what do we want to support a military for? It's not a military, it's the security of your nation.
Absolutely.
That's
Absolutely.
what it is. And they have not done that. They haven't put locks on the doors. They haven't put burglar alarms anywhere. There's no sensor cameras. Yeah. How can you do that with the second biggest piece of real estate on the planet? You only do that if you're incompetent. And that's another level of incompetence by Trudeau and his government.
Diane, it's always good to talk to you and good to see you. I haven't seen you for a while, and there you are in New York, a place we both love and lived there at the same time. Got to see you more often then. Thank you so much for the work you're doing and the things you're writing.
Thank you. Thank you. Anytime.
Yeah. Diane Francis, journalist, editor-at-large at the National Post, her own Substack under newsletter under her name. You can find that and subscribe to that. I don't know, almost a dozen books by my count. Are you
10.
working? 10. Okay, that's close enough.
Yeah.
Thanks again. We'll see you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
And that's it for this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. See you soon.